Afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Cortell, and on behalf of myself, my co-coordinator Frankie Sturm, and the Public Diplomacy Council, I'd like to welcome you to our Lunch and Learn Forum. A few housekeeping notes before we start. Sign in at the back. If you didn't RSVP before this morning, please write in your name and your email. We'll make sure you get invited to future events. Grab a sandwich. We may have run out of plates. My apologies. For those of you who are on the phone line, and we do have a few colleagues overseas on the phone line, please make sure that you mute your line and that you don't put us on hold if you have to take a call. Otherwise, we get to hear your lovely hold music. Just drop off and dial back in. Before we dive into our topic today, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ambassador Linda Jewell from the Public Diplomacy Council.
Hi everyone, I'll be very brief. Just want to thank you all for coming. I'm representing the Public Diplomacy Council, the founder of your feast. And we are sponsoring these lunches, as you know, just to build community and share best practices in the public diplomacy cone. So we're really happy. We couldn't do it without you, and thank you very much for showing up.
And if you like the event today, or if you attend other PDC events, for those of you who are active duty State Department folks, you can join the PDC as an associate member. You get lovely emails with roundups of public diplomacy themed events around town that I find very useful. And if you come to these events a lot, you'll probably come out on the good side of the equation in sandwiches by the end of the year. So take the plunge. So our theme today is disinformation and propaganda in the digital age. Disinformation and propaganda are not something that, they're not new to public diplomacy officers. We've dealt with this as long as there has been PD. What is new is the way that technology is advancing and modernizing the way that we communicate. This is transforming how ideas are spread. It's lowering the cost of communications campaigns. It's bypassing the traditional curators and filters of truth. And as public diplomacy officers, we need to adapt to this new communications environment. Quick survey for our panelists' benefit. How many of you feel like you are pretty well read in on the issue of computational propaganda and how these messages are flying about in our digital age? And how many of you are aware of the topic and here because you want to learn more about it? Okay. You're in the right place. We have some fantastic experts here who are going to help us understand what we need to know as public diplomacy officers to succeed in this environment. Our panelists have, I think, probably skew towards EUR in their backgrounds and expertise, because EUR has been on the front lines of this for a long time. They've been very aware of it and dealing with it. But no place in the world is immune from this, and it's not just state-sponsored actors, it's non-state actors who are using these technologies. So we're going to start off with Matt Chesson, who will give us an overview of computational propaganda and all of the sort of scary and or fascinating ways that it works. Tanya Wieck will give us the current perspective from EUR. And then Will Stevens, who is currently in charge of PD Tradecraft at FSI, but has some EUR experience very relevant to today's panel, will tell us a little bit about how FSI is preparing PD officers to go out and operate in this environment. And finally, Adele Ruppe from the GEC will give us an interagency perspective and tell us what the GEC's role may be in this. Without further ado, thank you to our panelists, and I'll hand over the mic. Actually, they have their own.
Hi, everyone. This one. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Matt Chessen. I'm a Foreign Service Officer at the State Department. I was fortunate enough to have a fellowship over at George Washington University where I was able to study science and technology policy. And while I was there, went there to research artificial intelligence policy, but wound up looking at a lot of the new emerging artificial intelligence technologies and how they're radically going to enhance computational propaganda over the next several years. And so that's what drew me into this. So I'm going to talk about computational propaganda and what it is and how it's used, and then also talk about some of the emerging technologies that are coming out in artificial intelligence that are going to enhance these capabilities. I do want to preface the conversation, though, by just mentioning that I think I want to say, and then I think everyone else should say in all of your conversations, that we shouldn't use disinformation, and especially the threat from computational propaganda, as an excuse for inhibiting speech online. I think this is a knee-jerk response by a lot of people and some of our partners overseas. And because the United States believes that all the rights you have offline are rights that you should have online, freedom of expression is really core to that. And so that's really one of our key messages we need to keep in mind as we're talking about these topics. So computational propaganda, what is this? This is the use of technologies like social media, big data, autonomous agents, which are typically bots and increasingly artificial intelligence, to persuade, to manipulate people online. Not all of this is malicious, so companies use some of these techniques to sell products and to get buzz generated around their products. Politicians use some of these techniques to sort of get interest in their campaigns, and that's where it starts to border into possibly some unethical uses of these types of technologies where they start impersonating other folks. And then you actually have malicious actors who are really just out pushing disinformation, right? And so how do they do this? So typically what you have is you already have online trolls who are pushing propaganda and disinformation. They will set up a lot of fake online accounts that look like the target audience. And so their profile information looks like whoever they want to influence. They put pictures that they pull off the internet. But these are actually run by trolls. And then what they do is some of these accounts are run directly by people, but some of them are actually bot accounts. And a bot is basically just an autonomous program on the internet. And so a bot will basically go and either push out content on a schedule, so it'll just either repeatedly push out content or every couple hours, or in response to a trigger. So you can actually have bots that push content out in response to news alerts and keywords that they detect, or you can have them push content out in response to somebody else tweeting. So a politician tweets, bots will frequently tweet immediately in response to them. And this works well on Twitter because the first one to respond to a tweet typically shows up at the top of the comments on Twitter. What do you actually use these tools for? So typically there's three types of bots. The first one is just a propaganda bot, and it's just trying to push a message out. It's trying to push a message out in high volume, get it out to a lot of people, because then the target audience looks out and sees a lot of accounts that look like people like them, and they're all repeating these messages, and so they say, well, these people all believe it, and it's getting echoed across all of these accounts. Maybe it's actually true, and so this helps reinforce the disinformation that's being pushed out. Then there's follower bots. So follower bots are actually trying to either follow people or like content, and they'll do this in mass, and they're trying to game the trending topic algorithms. So for a long time, people have been trying to game search engine algorithms and news algorithms to try and push content up to the top. They'll do this on social media to try and get the disinformation or whatever message they're trying to push up to the top of trending topics. And just psychologically, people tend to believe that things are more true if they actually see them, a lot of people liking them, or a lot of things in the top of trending topics. And then you have roadblock bots, and these are perhaps the most malicious. These could be things like hashtag spamming, where activists are trying to organize themselves using a hashtag, and then the bots will just go in and spam that hashtag with a bunch of garbage so that the activists can't communicate with each other and can't figure out what the real messages are. It gets a little more insidious when they're actually used to really directly intimidate or troll people and do something called doxing, which is where you actually release people's personal information online, usually with some sort of threatening messages. And so let's say a journalist in an authoritarian country is producing articles that the government doesn't like. Sometimes they will dox their information, release where they live, maybe where their kids go to school, and then they pile on with a bunch of bots and trolls to actually threaten this person and say, we know where your kid goes to school, we're going to kill you, we're going to kill them, we're going to kill your family, right? So this is trying to intimidate them into not writing and not expressing themselves and basically self-censoring themselves. So those are the three typical techniques that are used. These don't always violate the law. A lot of the content is offensive, but not necessarily illegal. But frequently these types of things violate the terms of service of the platform that they're actually on. So how are these tools actually going to get enhanced by artificial intelligence? So AI is not, we're not talking about sentient AI, we're not talking about Skynet, we're talking about narrow AI, which is AI that is used just for a specific purpose or tool. People are driving these things. It's not like the AI is out thinking about what messages it's going to put out. But there's several technologies that are emerging now that are really going to enhance computational propaganda. One is the chatbot. So if no one's used a chatbot, if you haven't used a chatbot, I encourage you to go online and check out on Facebook Messenger. You can play with Zo, Z-O. You can access that through Messenger app or through, just go to zo.ai. It's very lifelike in the conversations that you have. It's basically just a text-based interaction. If I handed Zo to you and told you this was my niece in college, you probably would have no idea it's actually a computer and not a real person. So you're increasingly going to have these chatbots that are able to have realistic human-like conversations. You're also going to have dynamic content creation. So right now, AIs can create music, screenplays, they've written books. They actually do some pretty good music, electronica music, and also classical music. And so you're increasingly going to be able to see these things dynamically generating content, including fake news articles. There's AIs online that actually generate fake news videos. There's thousands of them on YouTube right now. And this is just going to get more and more sophisticated. You also have affective computing. So this is computers that can actually accurately detect human emotions, but also accurately portray human emotions. And this is both text, video, and audio. So they're going to be able to tell whether you're angry, whether you're happy, what sort of frame of mind you're in, and then they're going to be able to convey the right tone to you to be able to persuade you. That combines really well with some of the psychometric profiling tools that are coming out. These are tools that are designed to figure out what your personality is, what your sexuality is, what your skin color is, all just from data. And they can do this basically from just likes on Facebook. But each American has anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 pieces of data for sale by data brokers. So there's a slew of information out there. We put it out voluntarily when we post things on social media. All of this information can be used to figure out everything about you. And then these other tools can be used to precisely target propaganda and disinformation towards you. These systems are also learning tools, so they can do A/B testing en masse with thousands of different versions of disinformation, figure out what works for your particular personality type and political background, and then fine-tune these messages based on the engagement that they get from different people. These tools operate 24/7, so while we're still trying to develop policy positions and generate press releases, they can be out there shaping narratives. You also have what I think is maybe the most insidious thing is these audio and video manipulation tools. You might have seen some of the videos of people in a lab who can map their expressions and their facial expressions to YouTube videos of Vladimir Putin and President Trump. There's also ones where someone has taken a photograph of President Obama and an audio track of one of his speeches, and the AI can actually generate a video out of that actually never actually existed. So you're increasingly going to see this audio and video manipulation that's going to create this sort of pliable reality, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to determine whether audio and video is actually genuine or not. These tools also have digital economies of scale. So once you create one and you configure it, you can basically create hundreds or thousands or millions of these. And so one of the concerns for actual engagement and really just democratic speech online is what happens when all of these machine-driven accounts are actually out on the web, on the social web, and are communicating, and they're trying to influence other people, but they're also talking to the machine-driven accounts, and then the machine-driven accounts talk back to them. And so we may get into this environment where you have this sort of swell of machine-driven speech and the machines talking to other machines. If you've ever seen two chatbots talking to each other, there's videos on YouTube of two Google Home devices that are talking to each other for hours, and it's absolutely hilarious. Some of it makes no sense, and some of it is sort of scarily realistic. And so we could be entering this environment, and so then the question comes up of where is the space for our public diplomacy? Where is the space for our engagement? And where is the space really for democratic speech online? I'll leave it at that and open to your questions later on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tanya Wieck. I'm the Senior Advisor for Strategic Communications in EURPD. It's a relatively new subset, small unit within PD that was originally going to be looking at a variety of cross-cutting communication themes across the European space. But rapidly, within the past year, it became solely about Russia and Russian disinformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the European space, recognizing that not people are operating in different parts of the world here, and discuss a little bit about what we're looking at doing on the policy side to get at this. I think it's very clear that Russia has, we all know this has been going on for some time. It's evolved. It's become a sort of different means are now at play, as Matt was just going through. But the way the narratives evolve is eerily similar to what it was like in the 80s as well. And that's something that EURs has been watching. It is a multifaceted campaign that's out there. It's individual to country. It's individual to audiences within a particular country. And I highly encourage folks that are interested in tracking these issues to really follow the work of think tanks who are most active in this space, because there's a lot of excellent reporting out there, particularly Atlantic Council, some of the European Values, GlobeSec, these types of organizations. And EUR relies a lot on the great research and the analytical tools that have been developed by some of our NGO partners. I think that's really critical in this fight. But looking at what they're doing narrative-wise, it, of course, is very complicated. And while we've been watching it for quite some time, being able to develop targeted responses and proactive responses, of course, continues to be a challenge for government, which is why coordination in all of this has been imperative. I'll make a quick comment that, of course, we are coordinating within the State Department. We are coordinating interagency. We have a number of foreign partners that we coordinate with. There are multilateral institutions that we coordinate with. Each one of these levels is imperative, and at the same time is a challenge, because we're each at also different places in this fight. With our foreign partners, they're at different places as well. But I think the priority potentially for this room is that I want you to know that this is absolutely a priority. This is a priority for the whole of government. This is a priority for the State Department. It's a priority in the European Bureau. And to that end, I do feel it worth mentioning that there has been a more concerted, aggressive, growing response. Now, to that end, what we're looking at too, and you will, those of you that have followed think tank discussions on this in the earlier days, it's hard to say early days, I don't mean the 80s, but the earlier days recently when this subject started to come to the fore and people were talking about combating disinformation. It's about getting online, right, and engaging with trolls, or having direct communication on these lines. And of course, what was learned is that that's not effective. Individual one-on-one trying to fight all these threads is not ultimately what's effective. And the discussions out there, of course, like we are fighting the same war, but we've got different tools at our disposal, and we need to be fighting according to our own strengths, not fighting according to what the adversary is using. And I think that's an important thing for PD officers to keep in mind. When we talk about narratives, we need to be thinking about our own strength narratives. This is about promoting what is accurate, what is truthful in the space, and where that directly combats disinformation, fantastic. But we need to be out there doing that continuously and proactively. One of the things that has been discussed quite a lot, of course, is where we find the insidious nature of disinformation in our European countries is where they find those divisions that already exist. In particular, say, whether it's along EU lines or NATO lines. For example, I was most recently in Czech Republic as the press attaché in Prague, and there are two larger than we would like segments of the audience, the public audience in the Czech Republic, that is uncertain of whether being a member of the EU really brings them value now, right? This is not true. This is not only true in Czech Republic, but in other countries as well. These sort of uncertainties, these quibbles with Brussels over, trade inequalities or whatever it might be. And also when it comes to issues of NATO and whether countries feel like they are really getting the benefits from NATO membership, they should be, vice versa. These, of course, are all narratives that are being played upon in the public space by, Russia or Russian-affiliated communicators. And so, to our benefit, I mean, these are institutions that we believe in, that we promote. And we, as people in the field and here in Washington working in public diplomacy, need to be more proactive about using those things that we already know to be true and getting those message out there in a more proactive and a more targeted manner with our audiences. I will tell you also that when it comes to the coordination mechanisms that we have within the State Department and interagency, we are getting better at sharing tools and resources and capabilities with each other so that we can be more effective in how we draw all those threads together. I also want to I don't want to get into too much detail because I want to pass it on, and I'm absolutely open to comments and questions later on. We are working on expanding our strategic view of how we want to approach this in the future as a bureau and for individual embassies in the field. And our three main objectives in looking at this are to work with our partners and help build their capacity, right? I mean, this is their space in European space, and every country is different. We have some incredibly active, very successful foreign governments that we've been partnering with and that we have learned from. And there are others that we want to work to build out their capacity still more, and that's a key objective for us. And as I mentioned before, the second one is to promote those truthful narratives, and to do so in a more proactive and targeted way, for which we need to make sure that we're doing the appropriate audience analysis ahead of time, to make sure that we are getting out what is needed to the correct audience. And then the third objective is building audience resilience. And as Matt's presentation addresses, and those of us that have talked about this before, we find that a little frightening. I think that's natural, but I will also say that there's something to be said for using traditional PD tools in our communications with our audiences about what is true, what was true yesterday, what is true today, what is true tomorrow, about the United States, about its partnerships abroad, about our belief in democracy and free societies and an open, free, healthy press, all of these things. And if we are very active in our engagements and our conversations, and we are not afraid to say these things in the face of whatever craziness we might see online, it continues to sort of build up that resilience in the public audiences and with the folks we engage with overseas.
Hi. Couple of things. Before we go too much further down, I want to use the term that we've co-opted at FSI on how we talk about this. This is a term that comes from the Shorenstein Center up at Harvard. There's a wonderful academic who put this out. It's called information disorder. And it really, in my mind, best captures what it is we're talking about, because it's not just disinformation, it's not just propaganda, but it's also the CVE environment. I was a senior advisor for CVE and AFPD, and we spent a lot of time talking about this. And what it really, to me, captures is the fundamental tectonic shift we've seen in how people are influenced. This isn't the first time that's changed. It happened when satellite TV came out. It happened when radio came out. It's happening now. We're living through it, and it's scary, right? We're all a little bit scared about it and why it's happening. But really, it's about understanding that there is information disorder and that people are changing how they're influenced, which I'm going to have a message today of hopefully of reassurance and optimism. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm a pretty optimistic guy. This is our wheelhouse. We are good at understanding how people are influenced. It's what we do for a living. And so it's our job to understand all those really big words that Matt used, right? All that stuff, it's coming. Does it mean that that's where everyone's going to be influenced? Probably more so in Moscow than maybe in the Central African Republic. That's why you guys get paid a lot of money to go overseas and why we have this massive operation to support people in local environments, because it's your job to understand the influence environment. So yeah, it's frightening, it's a little bit complex and chaotic, but fundamentally, like the essence of public diplomacy has not changed. It is our job to understand, inform, and influence. And the thing I think is most important and where we are focused at FSI is really reorienting our practitioners on that first step, understand. Truthfully, I think we're pretty good at the informing part. Maybe some are better than others, and writing press guidance doesn't mean that people read press guidance, but we get how to do our programs, we get how to get a message out, we understand that. But the understanding part is sometimes the thing that we skip. In the new PD strategic framework, it's the term, the first pillar is called audience. I don't love that term, but I love the concept, which is, it's the landscape. Where are you operating? And before you do any programming, you need to understand the landscape. So where are we focused? At FSI, and I think broadly in the cone, it's understanding the tremendous positive tools that we have to understand this environment, right? Along with all these scary bots and automated artificial intelligence, there are also really cool tools that can tell you how your message is resonating in a way that is inexpensive and instantaneous, right? You can tell that your message is reaching many people or not reaching people, it's getting responses, it's not getting responses. All that stuff is stuff that you need to be tracking. A couple of my staff are here and they'll know that I always say this, but social media is not something that you give to the 23-year-old intern anymore. Please, if there's anything you take away as a PD practitioner, it is that you cannot delegate social media to the youngest person on your staff to do separately. It is not separate. You will, and I argue with people sometimes in Ruppe about this. There's no such thing as a social media strategy. Throw it out the window, please. It is an engagement strategy. Social media is probably a space where people are being influenced, and you need to understand it just like you understand the editors-in-chiefs, and you understand the pollsters, and you understand the think tanks and the academics. You just need to add that big circle of digital media into your arsenal of people that you understand. You need to, if you can't figure it out, and you can't figure out, people here don't know it, go and hire somebody locally. That's what we did in Moscow. Nobody in Washington could tell me better than Moscow consultants how the Russians consume their information. So we hired a local firm. It cost like $10,000, which for our budget was pretty small. They gave us a whole landscape report. Turns out there's only 2 million Russians on Facebook. Right? So we spent all this time on our Facebook page. We're always worried about Facebook. And of those 2 million Russians, like 1.8 million of them were in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So if I want to reach a Russian in like Ufa or some city in the middle of Siberia, they are not on Facebook. Nobody could tell me that here, so I had to go to the locals. That's what we do, right? That's where we live. That's our wheelhouse, guys. You are meeting with the locals every single day. So the second aspect of understanding is using that to influence people in Washington, right? This is the other big skill set that we focus on. You and our PD practitioners need to do a better job of synthesizing all this information and articulating back to policymakers what it means, right? Not just, hey, nobody's using Facebook, but they're really popular on Instagram, so we're going to use Instagram. Well, if that's true, tell Washington about it in a cable. And if people are really falling for these videos that are being produced by machine-driven communication, tell Washington about it. Because I go to Fort Bragg, I talk to the people who do special operations and MIST and MISO, and they care. They want that information. People across the river want that information. Everybody wants that information. You have, as a PD practitioner, more information about the influence environment than anybody in the US government. That's also kind of scary. Because we don't think we know very much, but it's true. You have it. Figure out how to synthesize it and articulate it to policymakers. And that's what's going to make us all much more relevant in the future, which is cool because then it helps us look good and get good jobs. But it also makes our programs better, right? If you can say, you know what, people really care about this message. I've talked to pollsters, I've talked to editors-in-chiefs, but I've also looked at the digital landscape, and this is where what they're talking about, and this is what the current narrative is, and you can articulate that, and then you come back and say, hey, IIP, help me with this, and ECA, give me a program on that, and oh, DoD, I want some support on this. It's going to happen because you can explain and rationalize why it matters. So that's my one message. Just, it's our job to understand this stuff. You don't need to be an expert, right? You need to know that it exists, understand that it's out there, figure out how to consume the data. Social media is really cool and it has this great data analytics. Don't get snowblown by it, please. Tweet. I'll tell an embarrassing story. So when I was doing this, the stuff that you called tweeting at trolls, back in 2014, we did a couple of tweets, and Graham remembers this. We were sending out an account and we had this reach. And I remember sending a note to Ben Rhodes and saying, we reached 4.7 million people. Of course we didn't reach 4.7 million people. Tweet reach doesn't mean that, right? So it's very easy for us to fall into like the analytics and say this is what it really means. You need to understand it, articulate what it means, and then synthesize it with everything else you're doing. And then explain it to Washington. And that's it. I can step down off my soapbox now. Sorry.
I'm going to resist the urge to get on my soapbox. It'll be hard, Will. No. So I'm going to give just a quick bit of background on the Global Engagement Center in case folks aren't that familiar with it. But within the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, Senators Portman and Murphy led an effort to include language which gave the Global Engagement Center the legislative mandate to lead, synchronize, and coordinate all federal government efforts to counter both state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining U.S. national security. And that is a broad mandate. It encompasses not just the federal government here, but we are mandated, and there are 10 functions outlined in this legislation to work with foreign governments, to work with non-governmental organizations, with the private sector. And it authorized the Secretary of State to request additional resources if necessary from the Department of Defense. The Secretary Tillerson has approved a strategy for the Global Engagement Center to focus on the state mission, and that request has been made to the Department of Defense, and our office right now is focused on actually negotiating and doing what we might call the bureaucratic needful with our Department of Defense counterparts to make sure that we have the right framework in terms of a memorandum of agreement to govern this transfer, and then negotiate a set of pilot projects on the strategic priority countries. So we're in the process of doing that. We anticipate that the first tranche of funds will come in later this year, hopefully in the spring. And so that is where we are on the funding and the NDAA side. Historically, the Global Engagement Center has held the mission to be the lead on strategic communications to counter terrorists. So, for example, on the ISIS front, we led the strategic communications efforts to defeat ISIS. We are very focused historically on the counter-terrorism problem set. We now have the state mission added to that. But the reason that there was a drive to put this all in the Global Engagement Center is frankly because there was a widespread recognition that there needed to be a belly button on this, that there needed to be a center that could focus on bringing together all and ensuring the coordination and synchronization of efforts and identifying gaps, looking for overlap, to ensure that we are as effective as our adversaries. Because anyone who knows anything about this space knows that our adversaries here aren't governed by the rules and regulations, don't have to worry about clearing a memo with the interagency before they launch a new initiative, can at any given point in time direct all of the government's resources, and even in some cases the private sector, to focus their efforts on undermining our democratic principles and our national security priorities overseas. I cannot emphasize in this landscape where we face such nimble and well-equipped and very funded adversaries that we have to recognize ourselves that we have the capability, but we have to be smart and strategic. So it is very critical that you do your homework, that you know the landscape, as has been mentioned here before, about what are the nuances of how propaganda and disinformation are propagated in your area of responsibility. That could be a country, that could be a region. There is no one size fits all, but it is all interconnected. If the propaganda comes from outside, and I've seen that, it will come from other regions in many cases. If you feel you've got a good engagement in your country, then maybe the Russians will start dropping their propaganda from another country, and it'll come in your back door. That is something that we know very well. We won the Cold War once by being very smart and nimble, and we can certainly do it again, but in many cases we have to go back and relearn and upgrade and modernize our tactics. And PD can't do this alone. This is something where our adversaries use all levers of influence. That's information, that's military, that's economic, that's energy, that's political, that's corruption, and all of it's intertwined and interconnected. Unless you have a whole of government approach and a whole of mission approach, we are not going to be as effective. And that gets to the importance of having a game plan, having a strategy, and a good long-term lines of effort. If we only counter, we are only against things, we don't stand for anything, and that gets to the importance of having to have a positive narrative that you are hitting home regularly with all of your audiences. You can't cover everything, so you really need to drill down on where the key vulnerabilities are. If you're trying to hit the entire country, then that's not a strategy. Again, we can't stovepipe our approaches to these adversaries either, and that's why the GEC's mandate is so important. There are underlying principles and tactics that run across all of these, and they often take advantage of other tools, cyber, for example. This is not news. If you Google this, you can see that at times it could be that the Iranian hackers use the methodologies of the Russian hackers. So it's very important that we look at this as a broad problem set across even the non-state actors as well. And I am going to leave it at that, so we will have time for questions. But I want to reiterate that the Secretary, the Deputy, and our Undersecretary, Steve Goldstein, are all very committed to the Global Engagement Center and our legislative mandate, which encompasses all of the state and counter-state. It does not mention a particular country, but it is where that threat emerges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see we have a few people standing in the background. We have a few seats up here and would love to invite you to come and take these seats while you have the opportunity. I'm also just thrilled that we have a standing room only crowd today. We're going to open it up to questions here, but before we do, I wanted to mention I sent out some articles with the invitation. We do have hard copies of the Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy's report from last May on disinformation, bots, how does PD operate in the internet age. If you want to snag one of those. One of the other articles I linked to was one that Will recommended specifically about information disorder that I think is very informative as well, and one of Matt's pieces for the Atlantic Council that goes more into the Black Mirror future that we may be heading towards. As the first question, for those of us who work in bureaus in the department, whether they're functional or they are geographic, that just really have not had to deal with state-sponsored disinformation or have not been as aware of it as EUR has been, how do you recommend bureaus start to position themselves, and what kind of resources are available for those bureaus to get up to speed and start looking at things?
I'm happy to take a first cut at that as well. So I would actually argue that there's probably not many countries on earth that aren't experiencing these kinds of challenges. It's whether we've actually noticed or not, or our policymakers have noticed, because that can be a bit up and down too. I would start with looking at cable traffic. I would do searches for think tank reports, but I would also go and talk to the intelligence community, and that is INR. It should be your first stop, and ask them to pull information for you. You can go to the OPN office. That is our traditional public diplomacy POC within the INR Bureau, but don't stop with just OPN products. There is a lot of information out there on all of the regions and what is going on in them. And across the board of all the levers of influence, I probably have a 3-foot-high stack just of reports that cover all regions in my office, but I probably have a 3-tier safe of classified information that covers all these. There's a lot out there. It's just not, we don't have the best knowledge management, and so it's not necessarily going to be all in one place. But I think the information is there, and if you don't see it immediately, go out and talk to people. Go talk to experts. And there is a lot out there.
I would just say we've been working and trying to work with WHA, for example, on training and or DVCs, if it's a topic that people are interested in. You're really looking at a couple of different things, right? Anybody that's served in NEA will tell you that urban myths and conspiracy theories have been there forever. That is the NEA media environment. And so the Russians just use those, right? The idea that the US created ISIS was not a Russian propaganda idea, right? It existed long before the Russians ever picked up on it. They just took it because it was resonant. So dealing with misinformation, which is how we teach it in like the IO course, we call it misinformation or false narratives, is something that we all do every day. If you're looking at a state-sponsored disinformation campaign with malicious intent, what is that intent, right? The first step is to analyze it, and it's country by country, issue by issue, and it just gets back down to understanding the influence environment.
Yeah, I would just comment on I think awareness is the baseline. That's where you start. So no matter what part of the world that you cover or where you are, you start with awareness and everything that entails. So it's what's currently happening in the country environment, what the host government is doing. Are they aware of it? Are they doing anything? And yeah, looking at reporting. And starting with the baseline of awareness, and then is the next thing. So should we be doing anything about this? Are we the credible voice in doing this? Do we need to have a serious conversation with the host government? Are there NGOs that are active in this space? And then but awareness is the big thing. And of course in EUR at this point, and I feel pretty much across the board in the European space, there is awareness. You know, from country to country, some governments are more in denial, some are way ahead of the curve, and then you've got the mix of publics. Some publics are more aware and others are less aware. So it's all these different quadrants of awareness, which is I think what informs our baseline of then where to start next.
And I'll just put in a quick plug for the non-governmental resources. So the Computational Propaganda Project at Oxford University, they run a website called politicalbots.org. They put out about a dozen country papers analyzing computational propaganda in those countries. You also have a lot of think tanks looking at this. So RAND produced a great report called The Fire Hose of Falsehood. The Atlantic Council has the Digital Forensics Lab. German Marshall Fund now has this Hamilton 68 where they're tracking Russian disinformation. CNAS has done some great work on this. And actually, even in the academic community, you've got a professor here at GW right across the street who's doing great work on analyzing RT in non-English speaking audiences. So once you start sort of with the internal resources, make sure you take a look at the external resources because there's a tremendous amount of information out there. And if you want a quick start on computational propaganda, the report that Melissa mentioned, Can Public Diplomacy Survive the Internet, has a couple of great articles there on computational propaganda.
Anyone who has questions, please just come up and have that.
Maybe you can pass me the mic so we can Thank you. Chris Estradi from IIP. Great presentations. I was wondering if one of or all of you could address the issue of credible voices and working with partners who have a more credible voice in the U.S. state government.
Yeah, I can start off, and if you guys can provide some specific examples as well. I mean, I think it's the recognition that we're PD professionals, right? So we know we are not always the best voice, and it depends very much on the subject material. And so there's going to be times, depending on what story you see is getting traction. Sometimes it is appropriate for us to respond. Sometimes it's appropriate for us to work with our DoD partners and encourage them to respond. It is also important for us in our professional lives as PD folks to have built up a network of people in country or in amongst the NGO network that we can work with on these issues as well. Now, you're with IIP, right? And so when I think about credible voices, of course, I think about the project with, that was done in Russia, and building up relationships through other. I'm not sure, this is a public environment, so I'm not sure how much that I can talk particularly about that program, but there are ways of working with folks who are not affiliated with the US government, but we share common narratives and employing them to, whether they're on the blogger space or vlogger space or YouTube or whatever, to get across, again, what I talked about as those positive narratives, right? Those things that we always believe on, those things we can hang our hats on. And that's where we can employ others to speak credibly on those key truths, those key values that we agree on, but which an audience is like, yeah, United States, we've heard it all before, but having somebody else speak to those same things.
I think, again, it's so entirely dependent on the audience you're trying to reach. And in some cases, the US government to a particular audience may be the most credible voice. But in other cases, it might be the local TV station that speaks to them with the local voices. It could be a network of digital communicators who cross the spectrum and are working very broadly across the region. It could be religious leaders. It really is dependent on what is going to, the audience you're trying to reach, where do they consume their information, who do they trust? It could be their government, but you really have to analyze and research this. And I should have mentioned as well that we at the Global Engagement Center do have a lot of ties into the interagency. That's our job. So we are connected via different platforms and detailees to the interagency. And if you can't find an answer within your regional bureau or your post, we would be happy to help connect you. We have set up, I think, a site on the Ralph Bunche Library page where we're trying to post information on these topics, and if there's things that people are looking for, we're happy to help try to find them. But we also work with local partners to empower credible voices, and eventually we will go away. We're always present, but we can't be the ones that are messaging on this day in and day out. It has to ultimately be a local solution if it's going to be a long-term.
So a quick follow-up on that, because that's really important to EUR, that of course we talk about how every country is different, every environment is different, and this is why, I mean, our posts are the experts. I look at our embassies to lead the charge on this, because I from Washington can't say who the credible voice is in Lithuania or in Bosnia, and it is something that we want to make sure that we are empowering our posts to be as active in this as possible, and that it is our job to equip and support them in that effort. And so whatever I can do to help in the process of identifying who those credible voices should be in that environment, whether it's through audience analysis, helping identify potential local partners, NGO partners where post needs additional support, that's what we want to help get at. But from Washington, it is most definitely a country-driven issue.
Good afternoon, John Furr, American Spaces. Thank you all for speaking with us. Adele, you said it, and I challenge anyone in this room to disagree with it, that our organization is not very good at knowledge management. I'd like you all to speak to this. If you had all the money and you had the decision-making power, what is one thing you would do to improve states' knowledge management?
I might have written an unpublished paper that John's seen about this. That I can no longer publish in my current capacity. Essentially, we need to have that stuff stored, categorized, all the stuff I talked about with understanding, right? The cables, the academic research, the stuff that our partners are doing and reporting. It has to be somewhere and transitioned in a central place. Maybe that's the PD office in the regional bureaus. Maybe if it's a specific topic, it's the GEC on all this kind of swirl around computational propaganda and online disinformation and propaganda, whatever it may be. We need to give a lot more resources to that. Right now, if you look at how our resources are allocated, they're allocated on programming and activity, right? Most of what we do at Post and in Washington is activity, churn, go, 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 program, 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 and very little is on trying to understand what's happening, and secondly, on the second bookend, trying to understand what worked and what didn't work. That's partly, and here's my other riff, because there's absolutely no incentive for us to do that, right? Because one, we're not there long enough to see whether our programs worked or not, so they all worked, they're all wonderful. And secondly, there's no incentive for us as a new person to come and say, wow, you know, my predecessor was really smart, and they were totally on the right path, and I'm gonna keep doing what they did. And my EER is gonna say, I built on the wonderful work of my predecessor. I would love to see an EER like that someday. So those two institutional program difficulties, it's fundamental to the US government, right? We just focus on doing. If you're in a previous life, I used to do project management, and they have this wonderful phrase, go slow to go fast. You have to spend 60% of your resources on planning before you do anything. And unfortunately, we don't do that. And it goes even to like our digital people in the field. Anybody that's managed the social media coordinator at Post, what do? Tweet, write Facebook posts, tweet, write Facebook posts. In fact, I've heard stories, and we hear it in training, of like people getting yelled at for watching YouTube videos as social media. You're like, what are you doing wasting your time? It's their job to watch YouTube videos because they need to know what's trending and what's important and what's influencing people. But a PAO may just be like, no, we got to get this tweet out. We got to get this Facebook post done. Translate this. It came from my IP. We need to put something out about Fish Hackathon right now. Sorry. I hope nobody from OES is here. It's actually, it's a really cool program, and I love fish.
Yeah, just to riff on that, I mean, I think what the department needs to do overall is move from documents to data, right? So we create a lot of documents, and then they go on shared drives or maybe a SharePoint, but it's not data that can be mixed, remixed, accessed by anyone. So that's the biggest thing. I would also just like to get people thinking about data. You know, everybody says data is the new electricity, data is the new oil. I heard data is the new bacon, data is the new everything. But think about data in the context of what you're doing now. You know, a lot of these artificial intelligence systems, in fact, almost all of them that are emerging, really run on data, okay? You need lots of data to power these machine learning tools. And so if you don't have a plan for how you're curating the data that you're collecting and the data that you're encountering, you're really sabotaging people in the future. And so think about that. You need to be collecting it, you need to be curating it, and you need to be thinking about how it's going to be used, not just now, but how are you going to use it a year from now or 2 years from now? This is really critical to having success over the next several years and really over the next decade.
If I had the magic wand and the money, I would actually stop funding reports and assessing our knowledge management needs, because I think we do that every couple of years. And I would focus much more on and I would just fund it and actually do it. I think we know enough to get it done. But I would also focus heavily on the human component of that, because in my opinion, that's the biggest barrier. And I think Will talked about it a little bit. It's our reward system does not incentivize knowledge sharing, knowledge research and analytics. There's a lot written on this now, the death of expertise. I think the department needs to respect expertise, and our leadership needs to respect expertise within the department, and we all need to seek it on a daily basis and share it. We have to stop hoarding. We have to start working more effectively together. We have to recognize, and I recall a former Secretary of State saying, we're all on the same team. We have to work together to achieve the goals. And if we don't do that, we aren't gonna have the ability to actually effectively manage this.
It's 1 o'clock. If anybody needs to depart for other engagements, feel free, but we'll go until 1:15, so the microphone is open.
I'm wondering how you would rate the recent efforts of Twitter and Facebook to address some of these issues, and if you think they'll be effective. And your point about freedom of speech, maybe I'm missing something. I don't consider all bots talking to each other to be freedom of speech. And how do we kind of, are there some countries that have legal frameworks that make them more immune to this type of speech? And is it possible that the U.S. needs to kind of update or modernize some of our information laws accordingly?
So you raised some really interesting questions. And I'm theorizing now here. This is not State Department policy that I'm talking about. But I think we do need to have a national conversation in this country about things like satire and disinformation, and whether that's protected speech. I mean, it's not like we don't have precedent for this. False advertising was deemed to be a social ill, and there was a cause of action made against people who put out false advertising. So, should someone be able to put out a disinformation website and then have a small disclaimer at the bottom of the About page that says everything I'm writing is satire, and then they basically get a free pass? So I think that's something we need to have a national conversation about. There are, the United States does have the most sort of liberal free speech laws in the world. When you're talking about bots specifically, so this isn't sort of an open legal question, but if someone is behind the bot and pushing that content out, that's probably going to be protected speech because it's a person pushing that information out. We're not yet at the point where we have, and some people think we're never going to get there, where you have an AI that's actually saying, okay, I've got an intention and here's actually what I want to communicate. That certainly, well, unless the law changes, probably wouldn't be protected speech, right? But that's still science fiction and very far out. These are all just machine-driven tools that have people behind them that are pushing these things out. Now, are you protected if you are impersonating someone else? That's going to violate platform terms of service, and maybe we don't want that. But these types of things are also going to bump up against our international interests in having rights activists be able to communicate with each other anonymously. We don't want to have a knee-jerk response where we require verified identities online, because that's going to inhibit a lot of free speech around the world, and a lot of regimes are going to use that to really crack down on free speech. As far as what the tech companies are doing, what they have told us multiple times that we should not expect them to come up with some sort of big strategic solution to these problems. They're very focused on operational and tactical issues, and they're looking to the government to tell them what is the strategy for dealing with this, and looking to the government for helping them to align what they're doing with our national security interests. So we shouldn't expect that Twitter and Google and Facebook are going to get together and solve this problem. It's going to have to be a cooperative effort between the government and between these tech companies.
And I could be wrong, and there probably is someone in the room, there are a lot of people in the room much smarter than I am, but my understanding is the concept of free speech on social media platforms does not exist. A social media platform is a corporate entity. And technically, you don't have the freedom of speech on a social media platform. You agree to that corporation's terms and conditions. And that allows them to have the ability to moderate however they see fit. I used to get in big arguments about this with Russians, because Russian trolls would get banned on Twitter, and then they would get really mad, and they'd come outside the embassy and protest. Oh, you Americans, you talk about freedom of speech, and of course it would be on television and then put out on Russia Today. And I remember, and hopefully I was right, that freedom of speech as we think of it as a protected right does not exist on a social media platform. And please correct me if I'm totally wrong, if there's someone in the room that knows better, but my understanding is that's the legal ABC of it. Is that you sign up for those terms and conditions, you're participating in a corporation's platform, and that's the rules you adhere to. Now, as a government and as a policy, it raises a totally different question of whether we should be trying to regulate speech and what that means. I will tell you that if you look at how people consume news and you see the latest Pew things, social media platforms now account for something like 70% of the adult population in the United States consumption of news. So, is it really a social media platform or is it a news platform? And then that falls into a whole other set of regulations. And I'll tell you, the lobbyists from those social media platforms would argue vehemently that they are not news organizations because the regulations for news organizations are significantly more stringent than the sort of non-existent social media platform regulations. Yeah.
What I perceive is that, in fact, our adversaries felt very threatened by a free and open, democratic, truthful, credible internet, because they perceive that as being a key factor that, and if you look at how their worldview, they see it as a threat to their ability to control the populations, to maintain an authoritarian government. And so what I see, and I think a lot of the research supports this, is that they are in fact attacking the credibility of the internet. And if they can undermine it, if they can create such pollution in that information space that no one trusts it anymore and doesn't look to it for information, no one believes anything they read on it, then they have achieved their goal, because then that will reduce, in fact, the ability for ideas and democracy to spread. So we have to think in a larger sense as well about how do we maintain what is a key resource and platform for supporting democracy, as maintain its credibility and its effectiveness as a tool. I don't have the perfect answer, but I think we have to look at that much harder, and I think that the points that you have made are very important.
I'm Emily Bruchon from Ruppe, and I have a quick, less actionable question, but I'm interested in knowing your reactions to a few things I've read recently. You probably have seen about sharp power, the concept as a way to capture the space that is not soft power, as we as PD practitioners are comfortable with, I guess, and is not hard power, which is something else that I think PD practitioners are comfortable with, understand how it interplays with our traditional set of PD tools. Do you find the idea of sharp power to be something that's useful, and do you think it's something that PD practitioners should embrace and try to grow into? Thanks.
I saw the report and I read it, and I think I tend to fall on the end of sharp power, right? And in that, what are we trying to do as PD practitioners? We're trying to get people to do stuff for us, right? If we don't have an action in mind, we shouldn't be doing it. Right? If your activities as a PD practitioner don't have some sort of action, you want someone to change their behavior, then why are you doing it? So what I read as the sharp power is using sort of the left corruption and sort of pressure to get people to change their opinions. So the idea that you would co-opt a think tank author because you have some sort of compromise on the compromising material, or you would pay off and purchase think tankers in the Washington, D.C. area and force them to do things. Obviously, we shouldn't be doing that. I think that would undermine all of our activities. But should we be focused and targeted in what we're trying to accomplish? And should we array all of our programs to achieve a specific objective? Absolutely. I don't know if that answers your question. I know I read the report. It was a really interesting report. I think what it read to me was you're seeing powers like China and Russia not only get more active in the traditional soft power space, but bring sort of their aggressive and or corrupt practices into that space in a way that we would never do. I would say, on a segue, one of the things that I often talk about is we can never use the term information warfare, right? Adele remembers this. Because that's exactly what Russia wants, right? If a U.S. official comes out and says, we are in an information war with Russia, and we'll see, this is not State Department policy. No one, I don't think, would ever think I could speak for State Department policy. But if we say we're in an information war with Russia, we are achieving two very concrete objectives for the Russians. One, we are fulfilling their statement that all information is compromised and there's no such thing as truth, because then everybody that hears that will say, oh yeah, the Americans are doing the same things the Russians are doing. And two, we elevate Russia to the role of direct adversary to the United States, which is a role that they do not fill. Their economy is the size of Italy's, they are a fading power, they are a regional power, but by saying we're in an information warfare with them, it's like saying, hey, yeah, that's exactly what Putin wants, because then he can go to all his crony buddies and oligarchs and say, look how powerful I am. I'm at war with America.
I agree. I think we have to be careful with our terminology, not to play into our adversaries' hands. I do think, however, we have to have a robust and well thought out and developed information doctrine, because we can't be ad hoc about this. We have to have a good, solid, embedded plan and strategy for this, because countries like China do, as does Russia, and we should be as well postured as they are. I haven't read the article on sharp power, but I also believe that we have to be willing to deliver honest but tough messages sometimes. PD and soft power can't always achieve our goals, and sometimes we have to tell countries, our partners, that maybe they need to step up and take some tough action to help address the problems. Because if anyone has looked at how the underlying causes of why disinformation and propaganda lands and propagates, it's because it's landing on fertile ground. There are reasons why in some cases it's effective, and sometimes our partners have to step up a little bit maybe. It doesn't mean that we're not completely supportive of them, but we have to be willing, I think, to take some maybe sharper measures. I think we always have to be above board and stay true to our principles. So I don't know what if the article got into like to adopt our adversaries' methods. I don't think we should do that. But I do think we can't always be soft power about it.
Yeah, I think the key in all this is being targeted in what we do and why we do it. Just echoing in part what Will was saying, we are seeking to influence people to change opinions, right? And we need to be targeted in our environments to identify who it is that we're trying, what the audience is, and how we're trying to influence them. I think we should be clear about that. It's not just that we are PD people out there trying to win friends for America. I mean, that's great. But there's a specific purpose that we're trying to get at. And strategies and strategic thinking have not always been the strong point for PD professionals. And I know that has changed and is changing. And that's something that we talk about a lot. And in EUR PD in particular, this is something we talk about with our posts a lot. We do not do programs for the sake of programs. That is not what we do. Everyone has responsibility to make the time to do the strategic think. Like, what is it that you want to achieve? Who is it that you're trying to influence? What is going to get you there? And really put that on paper and really work to implement it. And we cannot be random about this. We need to, and it's something that at our posts, it has to be a whole of mission kind of thing. Our PD officers need to be talking with their intel counterparts. They need to see what is really going on out there to inform what they plan to do to engage with the public on these issues. So that's just what I want to emphasize.
So I would encourage everyone to go onto the states.gov website and take a look at Bruce Wharton's comments that he made at the Hoover Institution. I think it was in probably March last year, where he addressed some of these types of things. He was very clear that we should not imitate our enemy, right? Don't imitate the adversary in this. We cannot be using unattributed accounts, and we can't be spreading disinformation. This is something that's just going to contribute to the problem. I think another thing we also don't want to cede to our adversaries is that we're in a post-truth environment. This is a very dangerous concept. So, the United States was founded on Enlightenment principles. The Constitution is an Enlightenment document. The Founding Fathers were Enlightenment thinkers. And the Enlightenment's all about the search for truth through reason, right? And that's basically what our whole civilization is based on. And a lot of democracies are based on that concept. And so if we see that we are in this post-truth society, then truth becomes something that is just whatever you can persuade people of, right? And that is not a foundation for democratic discourse or a democratic society. So I urge people, push back on this concept all the time. There are facts, there are objective facts, there are truths, there are expertise. We are not in a post-truth society. That does not exist.
I agree 100%. And it also harkened back, I think Adele was the person that mentioned the death of expertise, which is actually the name of a book that Tom Nichols wrote not long ago. And he was a disinformation speaker for us in Czech Republic through IIP, by the way. But this concept, I feel like, is absolutely important because this is exactly what Russia's promoting in the information space, is that there's so much out there. How could you possibly tell what's true? So therefore, no one's really an expert. There is no real truth out there, but there is. There is black, there is white, and there are facts. There are things that are real. And as PD professionals and as diplomats and folks in Washington, we need to be propagating what is true and what is factual because it does exist.
So what's really interesting about computational propaganda is there's a lot of psychological techniques that computational propaganda really plays off of. If you're interested in these, they're in the report, Can Public Diplomacy Survive the Internet? There's an article there on the psychological techniques. But a lot of these techniques are actually designed to undermine exactly this, undermine expertise. Because if an expert is being attacked by a lot of people online, other people who aren't attacking them will just see this and it will automatically devalue that person's expertise, right? And there's a certain characteristics of basically the mob mentality that can overrule expertise. And so malicious actors actually utilize this to undermine experts online all the time. So it's good to know the psychological techniques that people are using. It's great to be aware of them, but then you can also counter them when you're aware of them.
Let's give 3 cheers for facts and a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to our audience, and I want to invite you to our February event, which will be on Valentine's Day, the 14th. It will be a conversation with Department spokesperson Heather Nauert and PDAS Susan Stevenson. So have a wonderful day. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, panelists.